Hello friends, Paper Historian here. I'm glad to welcome you to my channel, where we don't just flip through polite history, we drag the skeletons out of the dungeons and set them under the light. Tonight we're talking about torture, the most universal language humans ever invented. From medieval racks creaking in stone chambers, to colonial whips snapping on plantations, to cold fluorescent cells and enhanced interrogations in our own time, the methods change, but the screams don't. Every age finds noble words to dress it up: salvation, security, civilization. But at the core, it's always the same. Power trying to make silence speak, so settle in, maybe dim the lights and listen close. This is not a comfortable story, but it is one that has followed humanity for centuries. And before the night is over, you may find that the dungeon isn't as far away from us as we like to think. He does not enter a dungeon first. He enters a courtroom. Medieval torture begins less as a chain on a wall than as a clause in a book. A hall smells of ink and tallow. On a table lie charters and law collections. Canon law copied from Gratian's Decretum, royal capitularies, town statutes, and increasingly, volumes of Roman law revived in university glosses. When people say the Middle Ages tortured, they miss that judges were trying, awkwardly, often cruelly, to make decisions without witnesses they trusted or evidence they understood. Pain enters not through sadism alone, but through procedure. In the early centuries, he would have found something stranger: ordeals. A woman accused of theft might carry hot iron. A man suspected of perjury might plunge his hand into boiling water. An alleged adulteress might be forced to drink foul mixtures. The logic was aggressively theological. God would protect the innocent, or, at least, reveal guilt in the wound's healing. Bishops had long worried about blaspheming by testing God. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council did more than worry. It barred clergy from blessing the rituals that gave ordeals their legitimacy. In one stroke, the Church crippled a whole evidentiary system. Without ordeal, the court still had oaths and rumour, but something had to fill the gap between accusation and judgment. What rushed in was the Roman canonical procedure taught in the new law schools. In Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, jurists had been mining Justinian's compilations for tools: written records, inquisitorial inquiry, graduated proofs. From them, medieval judges learned a vocabulary: plena probatio, full proof; semi-plena probatio, half proof. Confession was queen of proofs. Other evidence, two concordant eyewitnesses, for instance, might substitute, but rarely. The trouble was obvious. When testimony conflicted and witnesses were scarce, how could you arrive at full proof without confession? That is where torture found its legal doorway. The new procedure did not unleash chaos. It circumscribed pain the way it circumscribed parchment. Torture, in theory, was permitted only with serious indicia, converging clues that fell short of full proof. It could not be used against pregnant women, the very young, the very old. It was meant to be proportionate, not lethal, and, crucially, confessions extracted under torment had to be repeated later, freely, before the record was sealed. On paper, it was a device to pry open obstinate silence in exceptional cases. In practice, exceptions multiply when fear, politics, and theology feed them. He watches a secular town court at work in the 14th century. The case concerns coin clipping, shaving precious metal from edges, a crime that threatened the market itself. Witnesses offer rumours, scales show discrepancies. The accused keeps denying guilt. The judge, trained in the IUS commune, writes that indicia suffice. The record notes: he was put to the question. The chronicle does not list implements. It does not need to. The town has a short repertoire: hoisting by the arms with weights at the feet, the strappado; stretching on a frame, the rack; squeezing feet or shins between boards tightened by wedges, the boot. point is not blood. The point is capitulation. Sometimes it arrives in minutes, sometimes never. When it does, the clerk writes again. The accused freely confessed the next day, as required, though everyone knows freedom has been stage-managed. Sentence follows. He attends an ecclesiastical court a few years later in Languedoc. This is not the witch hunt of later centuries. It is the Inquisition's earlier campaign against heresy, Cathars, Waldensians, movements the Church believes threaten souls and social order together. Contrary to myth, inquisitors do not ride from town to town with pits and fires ready. They first preach, announce a term of grace to confess and reconcile, take depositions quietly. Only when contradictions pile up and witnesses clash do they turn to the tool the learned law allows. The manuals, for instance, Bernard Guys, warn about excess, emphasize proof, codify caution. The act is still appalling. A human being made an instrument to produce words. But it is more bureaucracy than frenzy. The thing that will make later centuries shudder is the machine's calm. He turns north to England and hears a different tune. English common law, jealous of its own jury system, distrusts interrogation. There is no formal equivalent of Roman quaestio, no primary legal channel for torture in felony trials. The Crown still finds ways around. In cases of treason, the rack in the tower is employed by royal prerogative. Obstinate defendants who stand mute are pressed, peine forte et dure, until they consent to plead. But the judge's bench is less likely to rely on pain as a routine evidentiary tool. The result is not gentleness, the gallows are busy, but a different relationship between courts and confession. Where the continent breaks a body to reach the mind, England tends to let juries and hanging do the work. He crosses the Mediterranean and sees another procedural world. In Mamluk and later Ottoman cities, police courts and chadis wield the falaka, the bastinado, beating the soles of the feet, as a common form of compulsion for thieves and debtors, a seasoning for interrogation and a penalty in its own right. It is public and humiliating, not secret and juridical. In Islamic jurisprudence, the concept of had, fixed punishments, leaves little room for confessional torture in the most serious crimes. But in ta'zir, discretionary punishments, the stick speaks often. Pain here is part of a moral theatre of order. It polices streets as much as souls. He looks east to China under Song, Yuan, Ming. There, the law also kept torture within procedure. Interrogation could include framed methods, kneeling on chains, beating with bamboo, yet magistrates were required to record injuries and often to seek corroboration beyond confession. Manuals warned against excess. An official who tortured to death could be punished. Still, the imperative to extract a harmony of statements meant that pain was the grease of the file. Confession was valued because it promised cosmic and social order, admission of fault allowing restoration of balance. The magistrate wanted a narrative that fit the world's grammar. The stick supplied it. Back in Europe, he listens to theologians justifying the knife of law. They invoke Augustine and Aquinas. Pain can be medicinal. Coercion can rescue souls. The public good can sanction harm's private ethics fear. They emphasize intention. A judge must seek truth, not vengeance. They stress limits. But every limit is vulnerable to crisis. When plague burns through cities, when revolt rattles gates, when heretical cells seem to multiply, judges tighten screws faster. Generated within books, torture ends up fed by hunger, fear, politics, and piety. He stands outside a fortress in Bohemia in the 15th century and senses something shifting. The Hussite upheavals have cracked Europe's religious skin, and the old integrative powers of church and empire feel frayed. Torture here is not only an evidentiary device, but an instrument of war. Prisoners taken in campaigns are examined for intelligence. Urban councils interrogate suspected sympathizers for names. Pain migrates from the courtroom to the strategy room. The distinction between law and conflict blurs. He peeks cautiously into the instruments themselves, not to revel, but to understand policy. The Rack's principle is mechanical leverage, the Strapados is gravity, the Spanish boot and German Beinschraube compress bone beneath wood and iron. Various question of water methods exploit breath and panic without, so judges told themselves, spilling blood. The aim is not maiming. That would ruin the theatrical effect of a healthy body freely confessing later. The aim is terror that leaves a functioning witness in its wake. Public punishment is a different theatre. Whipping posts, pillories, amputations, burnings, meant to deter, to shame, to dramatise law's victory. Judicial torture is backroom. It has a smaller audience, judges, clerks, guards, and a larger ripple. It manufactures narratives that can be presented in clean ink. In this way, pain becomes epistemology. Courts are factories of truth, and the question is a tool to produce a finished product, coherent, sequential, notarized. It is not that judges want blood, they want closure. He flips forward in time and glimpses the witch panic to come, not here yet, but brewing. Late medieval suspicion of superstition remains pastoral, but as print spreads and confessional conflict intensifies, pamphlets will standardize a new target, the satanic witch, not merely a troublemaking neighbor, but a member of a cosmic conspiracy. When that happens, the legal machine of torture will be harnessed to a new myth, and the speed will astonish. For now, in the 14th century, most courts still distinguish between maleficium, harm, and apostasy, heresy. The smoke will rise higher in the early modern period. He watches skeptics stir even within the medieval system. Some judges hesitate, some theologians warn confession under pain is not reliable. Some cities restrict tools, fearing scandal or divine wrath. A few, faced with accusations born of spite, throw out cases. When royal politics intrude, when torture is proposed for an enemy of the prince, councils sometimes prefer exile or public shaming to broken bones that cause whispers. Even here, the law is not monolithic. It is a patchwork cloak thrown over a chaotic body. He thinks of the phrase, "Why did they torture?" The answer in this age is that they were trying to make truth tangible in a world where testimony was thin and metaphysics heavy. God had stepped back from the ordeal. The written record had stepped forward. Confession promised to bridge heaven and file. It is easy, centuries later, to see cruelty and nothing else. Cruelty is there. But the system's logic emerges only when one sees the clerk's neat hand and the judge's marginal notes beside the chain. Pain is a legal punctuation mark, an ugly comma forcing a sentence to proceed. Elsewhere, beyond Europe's fever, he finds parallel impulses. In the Maghreb, a judge orders bastinado to calm a market brawl. In Delhi, a sultan's kotwal employs lashes to extract names from thieves. In Kyoto, before Tokugawa law cools the city, a magistrate authorizes bamboo beatings of gamblers. In Tenochtitlan, long before Spaniards got their racks into Mexico, pain was sanctified in sacrifice, and extraction of names did not require screws. Across the world, power wanted closure. The tools were local, the desire was universal. What did it feel like to live under such a regime? He imagines a merchant accused of debasing dye, a miller suspected of secret hoarding, a washerwoman rumoured to be a heretic. Most will never see the question room. They will settle with fines, oaths, public penance. But the possibility of being taken to the question hovers like a winter cloud. It disciplines language. It punctuates rumour with fear. The law's private cruelty becomes a public caution. You can smell it in people's caution around speech. He ends his day back in that first courtroom, noticing what the medieval judge has tried to do, anchor judgment in more than God's whim. The price paid was terrible. In replacing ordeal with procedure, the system traded miracles for mechanics and swapped divine fire for hemp rope. The belief was sincere. A society ordered by texts demanded a confession to heal its uncertainties. When he leaves, the clerk is still sharpening a pen. The bench is still deciding whether the indicia suffice. Somewhere in the building, a guard is still tightening a strap, and from the church across the square, the bell rings the hour, indifferent. This is only the first movement of a long dissonant composition. The chapters to come will carry pain into spectacle, in autos da fe and witch trials, then into colonial prisons and secret police basements. They will shift tools from racks to sound, from boots to electricity, from public markets to private rooms. Throughout, the same questions will repeat. What counts as proof? What does a community fear? What will law allow men to do when it cannot bear uncertainty? And always, can a record born in torment ever be called truth? He shifts forward in time, and the medieval courtroom dissolves into the harsher light of the 16th and 17th centuries. Here, the scaffolds are taller, the pamphlets louder, and the targets of torture have changed. Suspicion now clings to witches, to rebels, to heretics accused not of trimming coins or muttering in back alleys, but of conspiring with the devil himself. The Middle Ages birthed the machinery. The early modern world fed it with panic. Witchcraft becomes the obsession. In small towns across Germany, France, Scotland, Poland, the accusation spreads like smoke. A cow died suddenly, a child wasted away, a storm wrecked crops, and someone whispers, "It was her." That whisper is enough. The accused is often a poor woman, old, widowed, sometimes a healer whose remedies worked until they didn't. Courts inherit the medieval rulebook. They need confession. Gossip alone is not full proof, but gossip is abundant, and fear multiplies it. The judge summons the accused, and when she denies the charge, as most do, indicia pile up until the dreaded phrase is written, ad torturam. The chamber is crude, a bench, ropes, iron weights, a rack or strappado. The boot, wooden boards bound around the leg, tightened with wedges until bones crack. The thumbscrew, turning flesh purple until nails split. The water ordeal inverted, gallons poured down throats until stomachs convulse. Fire used not to kill, but to blister. Each method is calculated not for spectacle, but for surrender. The woman screams, names others, retracts, then repeats under fresh torment. Soon the court has not one witch, but 10. The cycle feeds itself. Numbers swell. In Würzburg in the 1620s, hundreds die. Women, men, even children accused. In Scotland, King James VI pens a treatise insisting witches are real, lending royal authority to local zeal. In New England, a century later, Salem copies Europe in miniature. Spectral evidence, confessions under duress, gallows on a hill. Everywhere the pattern repeats. Torture makes confession, confession makes panic, panic makes more torture. Skeptics exist, but their voices are faint beneath the roar of fear. Inquisitions adapt too. The Spanish Inquisition, so notorious in legend, is bureaucratic in reality. Records precise, procedures formal. Torture is permitted, yes, but rarely to death, and always within rules. Yet its reputation is cemented by enemies and by its victims' whispered stories. The auto da fe, with its public penances and burnings, becomes Europe's theatre of horror. The dungeon and the scaffold together become emblems of Catholic authority and Protestant propaganda alike. Secular states are no gentler. Rebels in France face the question ordinaire and the question extraordinaire. The rack first, then fire or water. In England, traitors are pressed for pleas or stretched in the tower. In Russia, Tsars employ the knout, lashes that flay to bone. In Japan, during the suppression of Christianity in the 17th century, converts are tortured with pits, water, fire, forced to trample on crucifixes. Everywhere authority, threatened by dissent, reaches for pain. And yet the age produces its own critics. Jurists begin to murmur that confessions under torment are unreliable. Philosophers in the Enlightenment sharpen their pens. Beccaria, in On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, denounces torture as irrational. Why assume the guilty are weaker than the innocent? Montesquieu, Voltaire, others add their outrage. Their words spread faster thanks to print. Slowly, public opinion tilts. Still, abolition is uneven. In Prussia, Frederick the Great bans torture in the 1740s, calling it barbaric. In France, Louis XVI formally ends it in 1780, though mobs in the Revolution will invent cruelties of their own. In Austria, Maria Theresa restricts it. Joseph II abolishes it. England never relies on it systematically, but quietly ends the practice of pressing in 1772. Yet Spain, Russia, and smaller jurisdictions cling longer. The 18th century is a patchwork. Some courts still tighten screws, others preach reform. The irony is stark. Even as Enlightenment pens condemn torture, colonial empires export pain abroad. In the Americas, enslaved Africans are whipped, branded, broken. In Asia, subjects of European powers face summary beatings, shackles, forced labor. The dungeon shrinks in Europe, while plantation fields and colonial barracks become theaters of suffering. What remains constant across continents is the same logic: fear, uncertainty, authority, unwilling to leave silence unpunished. Torture is always justified by necessity. Witchcraft must be rooted out, rebellion suppressed, heresy confessed, slaves disciplined. The methods vary, but the pattern does not. He notices, too, how torture is narrated. Pamphlets describe witches on racks, heretics burned, rebels broken. Woodcuts show thumbscrews, strappados, iron boots. Horror sells, so does righteousness. Mayday, the public consumes these images with both fear and fascination. In this way, torture becomes not only a tool, but a spectacle in imagination. Even when hidden in dungeons, it circulates in rumor, in art, in whispered threats. And yet, by the close of the 18th century, a new moral climate is forming. The Enlightenment's language of rights, of humanity, of rational law begins to shame courts into abandoning pain as proof. Truth must be found in documents, in witnesses, in reason, not in screams. But the memory lingers, and the implements remain in arsenals, waiting for crises to revive them. Because torture does not end. It mutates. It leaves the medieval rack for the Enlightenment's colonies, the witch's boot for the secret police cell. Pain remains persuasive, long after philosophy declares it irrational. The story of the 19th and 20th centuries will show how the practice, supposedly abolished, resurfaces in new uniforms, with new justifications: science, security, war. For now, in the early modern age, he sees a contradiction etched in iron and parchment: torture denounced and defended, inflicted and outlawed, remembered and denied. Courts cling to it as long as they can. Critics imagine a world without it. Victims carry scars that outlast both. He steps into the 19th century and sees two faces staring back. One face belongs to Europe's courts, polished with Enlightenment rhetoric, declaring torture abolished, codes reformed, justice enlightened. The other face belongs to colonies, plantations, prisons, and armies, where pain remains daily currency. It is the age of hypocrisy, abolition on paper, agony in practice. By 1800, judicial torture is legally dead in most of Europe. France, once home to the question ordinaire and extraordinaire, formally ends it under Louis XVI. Austria removes it from the criminal code under Joseph II. Prussia bans it earlier, Frederick the Great sneering that confessions wrenched from screams are worthless. England had never embraced it systematically since the medieval ordeal disappeared, and by the late 18th century, pressing defendants under heavy weights is gone. Spain dismantles the Inquisition's torture machinery as the 19th century dawns. Reformers celebrate, quoting Beccaria, Bentham, and Montesquieu. Courts boast of evidence weighed rationally, of trials no longer stained by ropes and racks. But the courtroom's silence hides the cries that continue elsewhere. In colonies, officers treat torture not as relic, but as routine. In India, company officials whip peasants for unpaid taxes, tie rebels to cannons and fire. In Algeria, French soldiers suspend men by their wrists, burn their feet, suffocate whole villages with smoke. In the Congo, agents of Leopold's empire slice hands from workers who fail rubber quotas. Europe proclaims enlightenment at home while exporting torment abroad, like a commodity shipped with sugar and cotton. Slavery itself is torture institutionalized. In the American South and Caribbean, the whip draws blood daily. Branding irons burn initials into flesh. Iron collars with spikes deny rest. Treadmills force bodies to climb endlessly until collapse. Overseers call it discipline, but it is management by agony. Abolitionist tracts engraved the scars of whipped backs to shock polite society into recognizing that the age of reason still runs on torment. Even after emancipation, convict leasing and indenture ensure that whips and chains continue their rhythm under new names. Prisons in Europe become the new laboratories. Reformers believe confinement is humane, but the walls invent fresh torments. Solitary confinement drives inmates into madness. The silent system forbids speech, enforcing it with gags and beatings. Treadwheels force convicts to climb thousands of pointless steps until their legs collapse. Irish and English prisons make men march in circles for hours, their silence broken only by the crack of guards. In France penal labour camps, the bagnies use chains and whips as freely as any medieval jailer. In Russia, Siberian exile means frostbite, starvation, and guards' fists. The rhetoric is progress. The reality is exhaustion and pain stretched across years. Science arrives, and with it, new rationalizations. Doctors in asylums strap patients to spinning chairs until they vomit, claiming cure. Cold water is poured over heads until shock numbs. Electric currents are passed through bodies in experiments billed as therapy, but easily shading into punishment. Everything is recorded, measured, catalogued. Pain is justified not as superstition, but as medicine, discipline, deterrence. Where medieval judges sought truth in screams, 19th century administrators sought order in them. The spectacle remains even when the rack is dismantled. Public flogging is common across colonies, performed in parade grounds with crowds watching. Executions draw audiences in London streets and at French guillotines. Plantation overseers lash men and women before fields of workers as example. Travellers describe the scenes with casual horror, some moralizing, others gawking. The crowd is part of the machinery, taught through another's body what happens if obedience falters. Hypocrisy is the century's true signature. Politicians in Paris denounce the rack, while generals in Africa use the whip. Parliamentarians in London discuss humane codes while penal treadmills grind convicts' joints. Spain abolishes inquisitorial torment, while its colonial officers lash rebels in Cuba and the Philippines. Civilization becomes a mask behind which power continues its oldest habit, bending flesh until it yields. And yet exposure grows. Abolitionists describe slavery in the language of torture. Missionaries report colonial cruelty in letters that reach European newspapers. Journalists uncover mutilations in the Congo, photographs of severed hands shocking readers who had thought torture belonged to the past. Prison reformers denounce solitary confinement as psychological torment. Russian novelists describe Siberian exile as cruelty disguised as justice. Resistance comes from victims too. Prison riots, slave revolts, anti-colonial uprisings, all fueled by memories of pain. Their defiance proves that torment does not guarantee submission, only rage. By the end of the century, Europe congratulates itself on civilization. Museums display iron boots and thumbscrews as relics of barbaric ages. Textbooks describe witch trials with embarrassment. But outside the glass cases, tread wheels keep turning, whips keep cracking, chains keep biting. Torture has not been abolished. It has been modernized, bureaucratized, exported. The 19th century did not end torture. It reshaped it. From courtroom to colony, from rack to treadmill, from confession to discipline, pain adapted and survived. The stage was set for the 20th century, when science, ideology, and war would give torture its most industrial form. He steps into the 20th century, and the first thing he notices is not a rack or a whip, but paperwork. Torture has become systemic, not because one judge orders it, as in the Middle Ages, but because whole states decide it is necessary. Empires shrink, colonies revolt, ideologies clash, and nations build bureaucracies of pain as carefully as they build railways. The century of progress is also the century of organized torment, and the scale dwarfs anything before. The First World War sets the tone. Europe plunges into mechanized slaughter, and though the battlefield consumes most attention, prisons and interrogation rooms keep their own pace. POW camps officially followed the Geneva Conventions, but reports leak of beatings, starvation diets, endless drills meant to break spirits. Armies experiment with sound, light, and deprivation, testing how far soldiers can be pushed before they talk. Military police discover that exhaustion itself is an instrument. Keep a man standing for days, deny him sleep, and truth begins to blur. Compared to trenches flooded with gas, it looks minor, but these small experiments seed the future. The interwar years see new regimes turn torture into governance. In Mussolini's Italy, the OVRA, secret police, learns to blend traditional beatings with scientific refinements. Castor oil forced down throats, humiliation piled onto pain. In Stalin's Soviet Union, the NKVD refines interrogation into an art of despair. The cells of the Lubyanka echo with screams not only from whips, but from nights without sleep, lights burning constantly, prisoners forced to stand until their legs collapse. Confessions are scripted before they are extracted. Torture is the punctuation that makes the script legible. Show trials depend on it. Whole purges are written in blood and exhaustion. A medieval judge might have tortured one heretic for truth. Stalin tortures thousands for lies everyone knows are lies, because the point is obedience, not evidence. Germany under the Nazis industrializes cruelty with characteristic precision. The Gestapo builds a reputation for breaking prisoners swiftly. Beatings, whips, shackles, but also cold baths, suspension by wrists, starvation. Camps like Dachau or Buchenwald become laboratories. SS doctors experiment with hypothermia, high-altitude pressure chambers, poison injections. Prisoners are subjected to conditions designed not only to kill, but to generate data for military science. Torture here wears a double mask, interrogation tool and experiment. Victims are not only forced to confess, but used as material. The medieval rack seems almost quaint beside chambers calibrated to measure exactly how long a man can survive in freezing water. The Second World War spreads these practices across continents. Japanese forces in occupied China perfect the water cure, forcing gallons into stomachs, then stomping until water gushes from mouth and nose. Prisoners of war are beaten, bayoneted, starved. Allied interrogators are not pure either. Though rules exist, brutal treatment of prisoners surfaces in field reports, and colonial troops sometimes employ older methods, whips, sticks, fists, to get answers. Torture is not aberration. It is war's companion. After 1945, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims torture abolished again, echoing the rhetoric of the 18th century. Nuremberg trials condemn Nazi cruelties as crimes against humanity. Geneva Conventions are updated. Governments pledge in solemn tones to abandon torment forever. Yet in practice, Cold War paranoia ensures its survival. In the Soviet bloc, secret police, from East Germany's Stasi to Czechoslovakia's STB, prefer psychological torment, sleep deprivation, isolation, endless interrogation. Beatings persist, but the emphasis is on breaking identity rather than bones. Prisoners speak of the white nights, cells where lights never dim. Guards ask the same questions for weeks until minds collapse. Solitary confinement becomes a dungeon without walls. Padded rooms, silence or worse, noise blasted continuously. The psychiatric hospital is weaponized. Dissidents diagnosed as insane, pumped with drugs that scramble thoughts. Torture now wears a medical gown. In the West, governments proclaim opposition to torture while outsourcing it. Colonial wars in Algeria, Kenya, Malaya show how quickly democratic states return to whips and electric wires when insurgency threatens. In Algeria, French paratroopers suspend prisoners by wrists, shock them with field telephones, drown them in barrels. Officials deny it, but memoirs and testimony reveal a system too widespread to be rogue. In Kenya, Mau Mau rebels are beaten, castrated, subjected to forced labour under guard. Britain, proud of habeas corpus at home, runs torture camps abroad. The CIA studies pain like a science. In the 1950s and 60s, Project MKUltra pours money into universities, experimenting with drugs, sensory deprivation, hypnosis. Reports catalogue how long a person lasts under isolation tanks, how LSD destabilizes thought, how electroshock erases memory. The aim is mind control, but the applications bleed into interrogation. Manuals are written, circulated among allies. How to exploit fear, how to disorient, how to use white rooms, hoods, stress positions. Torture here becomes less about whips and more about the architecture of helplessness. Latin America in the 1970s and 80s becomes a theatre of terror. Military juntas in Argentina, Chile, Brazil adopt electric shocks as their signature. The paicana delivers jolts to genitals, tongues, breasts. Prisoners are submerged in water, hung from ceilings, beaten with truncheons. Families disappear into night, their screams erased by denial. Torture is not incidental, but structural. It maintains dictatorship by instilling fear in every household. Manuals provided by American advisors, ostensibly to teach counterinsurgency, blend into local brutality. Torture is globalization long before trade agreements. Elsewhere, apartheid South Africa tortures activists with beatings, suffocation, psychological games. Middle Eastern regimes, armed with Western weapons, maintain dungeons where prisoners are whipped, burned, shocked. Torture is not ideology-specific. Fascists, communists, Democrats, monarchs all find uses. The justifications shift: national security, counter-terrorism, civil order, but the practice remains. What distinguishes the 20th century from earlier centuries is not the existence of torture, but its systematization. Stalin's purges, Nazi camps, CIA manuals, junta prisons. These are not isolated courts seeking confession. They are bureaucracies with budgets, staff, paperwork. Torture becomes industrial, like steel or coal. Files record how many confessions extracted, how many names given. Doctors supervise, ensuring victims survive long enough to speak. Engineers design rooms where sound amplifies, where light blinds, where silence itself becomes an assault. The cruelty is rationalized, efficiency, science, necessity, and yet resistance grows alongside. Survivors publish memoirs. Solzhenitsyn, describing the Gulag, Primo Levi the camps, Latin American exiles the secret prisons. Journalists expose CIA programs, French atrocities in Algeria, British abuses in Kenya. Human rights organizations, Amnesty International, founded in 1961, make torture a public word again. Photographs of bruises, testimonies of scars, reports of methods accumulate. states deny, but denial itself proves knowledge. The spectacle is not public whippings in markets, it is dossiers circulated in parliaments, campaigns waged in newspapers. Torture is hidden, but not silent. The century ends with irony. Liberal democracies sign conventions banning torture absolutely, no exceptions. Yet covert programs continue, justified by emergencies. Authoritarian states never stop. Terrorist groups adopt torture themselves, filming executions, broadcasting cruelty as propaganda. Pain is still political theatre, only the stage has shifted. From scaffold to secret prison, from town square to global television. So when he leaves the 20th century behind, he sees not abolition, but mutation. The rack is gone, the dungeon replaced by the white room, the thumbscrew by electrodes, the whip by waterboarding. The logic is unchanged. Fear of uncertainty, hunger for control, impatience with silence. Medieval judges sought confession. Modern states seek compliance. Both find the answer in torment, and the century that invented human rights also perfected the instruments that violate them. Progress and cruelty march side by side, as if history cannot separate them. He steps deeper into the 20th century, and the chamber grows quieter. No rack, no whips, no dripping chains. Instead, there is nothing. A room painted white, without windows, without corners, without sound. Here he realizes that torture has learned a new trick, not only to batter the body, but to dissolve the mind. Pain is no longer just broken bones, it is disorientation, isolation, silence, and noise wielded like weapons. The white room becomes emblematic. Victims are shut inside spaces designed to erase perception. Fluorescent lights burn without pause, 24 hours a day. Walls gleam featureless, doors close without handles. There is no sense of time, no dawn, no dusk, only a continuous glare that seeps into thought. Guards wear soft shoes. Food arrives without warning. Interrogations begin at random hours. The body remains intact, but the prisoner's sense of self begins to fray. Hours stretch into hallucinations. Some start to talk to walls, others to forget words. When they emerge, they will often confess anything, not because of pain, but because the world has lost shape. This is the century's great shift, torture that leaves no obvious scars. In Nazi camps, scars were written into flesh. In gulags, bones bore witness. In the age of white rooms, the torment is invisible, deniable, yet devastating. A doctor can examine the prisoner and see nothing, while the mind collapses unseen. Noise joins silence as a weapon. Interrogators discover that sound can drive people mad, faster than whips. Speakers blast heavy metal, marching anthems, or meaningless static at deafening levels, hours or days on end. In other cases, the torture is subtler, a single sound repeated endlessly, a baby crying, a dripping faucet, a shrill whistle. Victims cannot escape it. Their thoughts are drowned, their sense of time disintegrates. Where medieval tormentors tightened screws, modern ones turn dials. Sleep deprivation proves equally potent. Keep a prisoner awake for 72 hours and his mind unravels. Lights never dim, guards shout whenever eyelids droop, loud noises erupt randomly. Some prisoners are forced to stand, arms shackled overhead, until legs give out. The body begs for rest, but rest is denied. Hallucinations set in, visions, voices, dream fragments intruding into waking life. Confessions extracted in such states are worthless as truth, but priceless as control. The prisoner will sign anything, say anything, just for the promise of 1 hour of sleep. Then comes humiliation. Interrogators understand that dignity can be weaponized. Prisoners are stripped naked, forced to crawl, paraded before others. Some are smeared with filth, others compelled to perform degrading acts. Religious prisoners are forced to desecrate holy objects, violating their own faith under duress. Sexual humiliation, groping, forced nudity, simulated assault becomes a common method. Unlike the lash, humiliation attacks not just the body, but identity, shame, and community. It lingers long after bruises heal because victims relive it silently, ashamed to speak of it. Water is reimagined too. The medieval ordeal by water tested innocence. The 20th century, waterboarding drowns minds without killing. A cloth covers the face, water poured steadily, flooding nose and mouth. The gag reflex triggers, lungs convulse, panic explodes. The prisoner knows rationally that death may not come, but the body screams that it already has. Few methods break people faster. American intelligence agencies use it, denying that it counts as torture. Survivors insist otherwise. The scars are not on skin, but in memory. A drowning repeated thousands of times in dreams. Psychological games become routine. Interrogators threaten family members, fabricate evidence, play good cop and bad cop. Some prisons use mock executions, dragging prisoners before firing squads, pulling triggers with blanks, leaving them shaking, certain they have died. Others simulate rescue, staging fake conversations where the prisoner hears comrades have betrayed him. Truth and falsehood blur until nothing feels solid. Drugs are added to the arsenal. In Soviet prisons, dissidents are injected with chemicals that cloud thought, induce confusion, or mimic psychosis. In American experiments, LSD is tested as a tool to unravel defenses. In Latin American dictatorships, prisoners are sedated, then woken mid-interrogation to destabilize memory. Pain is chemical, confusion pharmacological. Even space itself is turned against captives. Cells are made deliberately too small to stand or lie comfortably, forcing twisted positions for hours. Others are too cold or too hot. Prisoners are kept in darkness for weeks, then blinded by sudden light. Food is rationed irregularly, water is withheld. Torture here is not one act, but a system of conditions designed to grind. What makes these methods distinct is their invisibility. A man leaving a white room carries no welts. A woman subjected to sleep deprivation bears no scars. A prisoner humiliated in silence may never speak of it, ashamed. States exploit this invisibility, insisting torture is gone while practicing it daily. Pain that leaves no mark is easier to deny. Yet survivors tell. Memoirs from gulags describe the endless interrogations, the nights without sleep, the humiliations. Latin American exiles recall the picana, but also the mock executions and naked parades. Victims from Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib speak of white rooms, dogs, nudity, sound, waterboarding. Each testimony adds to the record, making visible what regimes tried to erase. The 20th century's genius is bureaucracy. Medieval torturers left bloodstains, modern ones leave paperwork. Reports describe prisoners subjected to enhanced techniques, resistant but manageable, broken after 72 hours. Euphemism cloaks torment in sterile language. Doctors are present, monitoring pulses, ensuring victims do not die too soon. Pain becomes protocol, cruelty administrative. And yet, the purpose is unchanged. Whether with rack or with white light, the goal is compliance, not truth. No state truly believes the confessions are reliable. What matters is obedience, silence, control. Torture is never about knowledge, it is about domination. The white room, the blaring speaker, the sleepless night, they are the 20th century's strappado, updated for an age that pretends to despise brutality. He leaves this chamber with a grim realization. Torture has evolved, but not disappeared. The tools are subtler, the scars invisible, the language euphemistic. But the logic is ancient. When power feels threatened, it reaches for pain. Only the methods change. He walks into the late 20th century and sees how torture slips easily into the vocabulary of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. The guillotine and rack are long gone, but the justifications are familiar. Threats to the state, dangers to security, enemies too shadowy for courts. Pain is wrapped in the language of necessity. The Cold War gives every regime an excuse to use it, and the collapse of empires ensures plenty of rebels, guerrillas, and suspects to test it on. The scale is vast, the scars largely invisible, and the denials louder than ever. In South America, military hunters perfect the art of disappearance. In Argentina, during the dirty war of the 1970s, thousands vanish into clandestine detention centers. Cells stink of urine and fear. Screams echo down corridors. Electric prods, the picana, buzz against genitals, tongues, breasts. Prisoners are beaten, drowned in tubs, hung from ceilings in stress positions. Mothers demand answers in plazas, carrying photographs of children who never return. The generals deny torture, even as survivors whisper about it in exile. Torture is not incidental, but systematic, a language of fear designed to silence whole neighborhoods. Chile under Pinochet is no different. After the 1973 coup, stadiums become prisons, interrogators shock prisoners with wires, simulate drownings, force confessions, broadcast on television. Secret police torture not only to extract information, but to remind a population that resistance is suicidal. Files discovered later prove how organized it was. Lists of names, reports of methods, notes about which detainees broke quickly. The apparatus of cruelty is as meticulous as any military drill. Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Guatemala. The pattern repeats. Dictatorships, armed with Western training and funding, build secret cells where bodies are stripped, beaten, shocked, humiliated. The School of the Americas in Panama trains officers in interrogation manuals that describe sensory deprivation, stress positions, threats. Officially, these are methods short of torture. In practice, they are indistinguishable. Survivors testify of being forced naked into cold rooms, deprived of sleep, raped or shocked until they faint. The continent becomes a laboratory of pain dressed up as counter-terrorism. Vietnam burns its own legacy into memory. Both French and American forces build detention centers to interrogate Viet Minh and later Viet Cong suspects. Beatings, water torture, electric wires are commonplace. The infamous tiger cages of South Vietnam, tiny cells where prisoners crouch in sweltering heat, shackled and exposed, are exposed by journalists, shocking audiences abroad. Interrogation blends seamlessly with punishment. Suspects are broken not just for intelligence, but to terrify others into silence. The war's official rhetoric is freedom and democracy. The reality is electrodes and ropes. The United States enters the late 20th century, certain it has moved beyond medieval cruelty. Politicians denounce torture in dictatorships, publish reports, fund human rights. Yet intelligence services quietly train allies, circulate manuals, advise in secret. In Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, American fingerprints appear on programs of pain. The contradiction is glaring. Human rights as export, torture as practice. By the late 1990s, the stage is global. Counter-terrorism replaces communism as justification. The September 11th attacks in 2001 pushed the United States and its allies into new wars, and torture resurfaces under another euphemism: enhanced interrogation. At Guantanamo Bay, prisoners in orange jumpsuits are hooded, shackled, deprived of sleep for weeks, blasted with noise, frozen in cells, forced into stress positions until joints give out. At CIA, black sites scattered across the globe, detainees are waterboarded, stripped, humiliated. Doctors monitor vital signs. Lawyers draft memos arguing why it is not technically torture. The logic is chilling. If it leaves no lasting scars, if the intention is intelligence, it must be lawful. Survivors disagree. They emerge shattered, describing drowning, panic, hallucinations, despair. The scars are inside, invisible but permanent. Abu Ghraib in Iraq reveals the truth in photographs too stark to deny. Hooded men stand on boxes with wires attached to their fingers. Naked prisoners are piled in pyramids. Dogs bare teeth inches from cowering faces. The images spread worldwide, symbols of a superpower caught practicing what it condemned. Officials insist these were rogue soldiers, not policy, yet testimonies and documents show otherwise. The practices mirrored those codified in training manuals, exported to allies, recycled under new names. Elsewhere, the same script runs. In Israel and Palestine, detainees describe stress positions, beatings, sleep deprivation, and sound torture. In Chechnya, Russian forces operate filtration camps where prisoners are beaten, shocked, mutilated. In Algeria during the 1990s civil war, both state and insurgents torture prisoners, broadcasting horror to prove dominance. In Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Western allies in the war on terror, dungeons operate openly. Rendition flights carry suspects to these countries precisely because their torturers are less squeamish. Globalization of torture is complete. Intelligence circulates, prisoners circulate, pain circulates. What distinguishes this era is not just cruelty, but secrecy paired with exposure. States deny, yet evidence leaks constantly. Survivors write memoirs, journalists publish investigations, NGOs produce reports. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. The Red Cross all document abuses. Photographs, leaked memos, whistleblowers expose hypocrisy. Torture is simultaneously denied and undeniable, outlawed and institutionalized. The methods have evolved, but the logic is ancient. Sensory deprivation, waterboarding, stress positions. These are the rack and boot of the 21st century. Where medieval judges sought confessions for proof, modern states seek intelligence, compliance, or simple domination. The goals differ in detail, but not in essence. Silence, obedience, fear. Torture is never about truth, it is about power. What changes is the theatre. In the Middle Ages, towns whispered about the dungeon. In the early modern age, pamphlets described witches screaming on racks. In the 20th and 21st centuries, torture circulates as photographs, leaked documents, survivor testimonies on television. The spectacle persists, only the medium changes. Pain remains political theatre. Resistance grows in parallel. Survivors from Latin America testify in truth commissions, describing electric shocks and disappearances. Victims from Guantanamo publish memoirs, shaming governments that claim to defend rights. Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires march weekly, refusing silence. Algerian war veterans confess to torturing prisoners, sparking public reckoning decades later. Torture produces not only fear, but memory. A memory can undo regimes as surely as rebellion. And yet the practice continues. States still argue that exceptional circumstances justify it. Terrorism, insurgency, rebellion, each becomes a new excuse. Euphemisms shift, but the tools remain. The world condemns torture at summits, signs conventions, builds museums to medieval cruelty, then funds intelligence services that perfect the same logic behind closed doors. He leaves this century of contradictions with one conclusion. Torture has not vanished. It has only adapted. From the rack to the white room, from the thumbscrew to the waterboard, from the town dungeon to the global black site network, the line is unbroken. Pain is still treated as a shortcut to control, as proof that the state cannot be challenged. The scars are more hidden now, the language more euphemistic, but the screams are the same. And the irony is complete. The modern age that prides itself on human rights has made torture more deniable, more scientific, more global than any medieval judge could have dreamed. He moves his gaze away from Europe and the Americas and lets it linger across other continents because cruelty has never belonged to a single culture. The idea that pain can reveal truth, force obedience, or frighten communities into silence is older than any single empire and broader than any one ideology. The 20th century, with its white rooms and bureaucratic black sites, may look new, but in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the repertoire of torment developed in parallel, often centuries earlier, and at times intertwined with European practices. He begins in China, where dynasties framed torture not as aberration, but as instrument of law. From the Tang through the Qing, the state prized confessions as proof of harmony restored, and magistrates were permitted, sometimes required, to use force when words failed. The bamboo rod was omnipresent. Light beatings across the buttocks or thighs, heavier lashes for more serious crimes, were not considered torture but routine punishment, yet interrogation often escalated beyond that. Prisoners knelt on chains, fingers crushed in wooden clamps, shins squeezed between rods tightened with cords. Manuals instructed magistrates to calibrate pressure, to record injuries, to avoid death that might shame the court. Confession was the goal, not destruction. A man who confessed could be sentenced, order restored, cosmos balanced. A man who resisted threatened not only law but heaven's mandate. One method described in Qing records involved placing sticks between a suspect's fingers and squeezing until nails split. Another strapped prisoners to benches where knees were bound and beaten. The logic echoed medieval Europe's, pain as punctuation, confession as text. Yet Chinese law books were explicit. If torture killed the accused, the magistrate could be punished. Responsibility for balance rested heavily on officials, which meant they learned to extract obedience through calibrated cruelty. It was bureaucracy and brutality braided together. In Japan, cruelty was both state and spectacle. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, torture was permitted to confirm confessions in serious crimes. Beatings with bamboo, burning with candles, immersion in cold water during winter, all were employed. Particularly notorious was the tsurushi, or reverse hanging. The victim suspended upside down, arms bound behind the back, body slowly lowered into a pit sometimes filled with excrement. The agony was prolonged, joints dislocating, lungs struggling under inverted pressure. For Christian converts captured during the 17th century persecutions, this became the signature torment. The shogunate demanded apostasy. The pit extracted it. Those who refused to step on crucifixes after days of tsurushi became martyrs. Those who yielded were broken twice, body and soul. The method shows torture's true essence, not truth-finding, but obedience-forcing. Japan's wartime history reawakened these practices in new form. During the Second World War, the Kempeitai, military police, revived water torture, beatings, and electric shocks against prisoners of war and civilians. Survivors describe bamboo driven under fingernails, heads forced into buckets until drowning seemed certain, genitals burned with cigarettes. The techniques were local in detail but global in logic: humiliation, exhaustion, destruction of will. The cruelties of Europe and Asia rhymed without needing translation. The Ottoman Empire, sprawling across centuries and continents, maintained its own library of torment. Bastinado, the falaka, was its hallmark. Soles of the feet beaten with sticks until walking became impossible. It was common for thieves, debtors, dissidents. The method left few lasting marks, but inflicted agony, making it ideal for both punishment and interrogation. Other methods included suspension by arms, burning, confinement in tiny cells. European diplomats in Constantinople sometimes reported scenes of men dragged into courts, forced flat, legs bound, feet whipped until they screamed confessions. To Ottomans, this was justice calibrated. To Europeans, it was both exotic and familiar, a mirror of their own hidden dungeons. North Africa and the Middle East had variations, often rooted in corporal punishment traditions. In Morocco, bastinado was routine in the 19th century, floggings carried out in public squares as warnings. In Egypt, Khedive's prisons employed whips and sticks liberally. Under colonial rule, European powers absorbed and adapted these methods. French officials in Algeria during the 19th century learned from Ottoman and local practices, blending bastinado with European rack and suspension. By the 20th century, these techniques resurfaced in counterinsurgency campaigns, proving how cultural exchange often meant cruelty exchange. In Africa, south of the Sahara, torture was woven into both pre-colonial justice and colonial oppression. Among some kingdoms, punishments included beatings, mutilation, or confinement in pits. These were harsh but embedded in customary law, often limited in scale. European colonizers brought different energies: whips used on plantations, shackles in mines, forced labor enforced with pain. In Congo, under King Leopold II, cutting off hands of workers who failed quotas became a symbol of industrialized cruelty. The image of children holding severed limbs beside baskets of rubber reveals torture not as interrogation but as management system. It terrorized communities into producing more. African landscapes became laboratories where European and local cruelties fused. India under Mughal and later colonial rule shows similar blending. Mughal emperors employed elephant trampling, beatings, and hot irons for rebels and traitors. British East India Company officers, though claiming Enlightenment values, flogged peasants, tied men to cannons, applied thumbscrews, and sanctioned hangings without trial. The colonial logic echoed medieval Europe's but dressed in imperial rhetoric. The whip as discipline, the noose as law. Torture was governance, and governance was cruelty. Southeast Asia's record is no gentler. In Burma and Siam, rebels were crushed in bamboo cages, starved or left exposed to insects. In Vietnam, Nguyen emperors inflicted floggings, mutilations, drownings. When French colonizers arrived, they replaced local torments with their own: stocks, whips, forced marches, yet retained bamboo for its efficiency. Pain was always practical, never absent. He notes too how ritual and spectacle infused these practices. In many cultures, public torment was meant to shame as much as to injure. Bastinado in Ottoman squares, floggings in African villages, crucifixions in Japanese provinces, all told communities that the state's reach was intimate. Torture was not hidden in dungeons alone, but staged as civic lesson. The crowd became accomplice, learning obedience through someone else's screams. By the 20th century, globalization ensured these traditions merged. European colonial officers recorded local methods, sometimes banning them as barbaric, sometimes adapting them quietly. Asian and African elites trained in Western schools returned with knowledge of both law and cruelty. Police manuals circulated, blending phalaka with electricity, bamboo with waterboarding, colonial whips with modern psychology. The global archive of torment became thicker, more interchangeable. And in every culture, justification mirrored the others. In China, harmony requires confession. In Japan, apostasy must be proven. In the Ottoman world, order demands punishment. In Africa, under colonialism, labor must be coerced. In Europe, truth requires confession. Rebellion must be crushed. The words changed, the screams did not. What emerges from this panorama is not a hierarchy of cruelty, but a chorus. Torture has no nationality. The bamboo rod and the rack, the phalaka and the thumbscrew, the pit and the white room, all belong to a shared human repertoire of domination. Each culture believed its methods rational, necessary, even merciful compared to alternatives. Each produced bureaucrats to record, priests to justify, crowds to watch. And each left scars in memory. He leaves these continents with the sobering thought that cruelty is one of humanity's most universal exports. Empires traded spices, silk, and gold, but also techniques of pain. Colonizers denounced local torments as barbaric, even as they refined them with European devices. Locals adopted foreign methods when they served power. Torture proved endlessly adaptable, a shared language spoken across borders. And as the world entered the modern age of revolutions and wars, these methods did not vanish. They waited, blended, resurfaced. In gulags, in colonial cells, in CYA manuals, in military juntas. The bamboo, the whip, the wire, the silence. They are different alphabets of the same sentence. Authority made flesh through suffering. He pauses now, not in a dungeon or a secret cell, but in a marketplace, because torture has always had a second stage, the public square. For centuries, the pain inflicted in private chambers found its echo in spectacles staged before crowds. Punishment became theatre, cruelty became pedagogy, and communities learned through another person's suffering how the law defined order. Even as states in the 19th and 20th centuries moved torture into hidden rooms, the logic of spectacle lingered, in executions, parades, and eventually in the media that fed millions of eyes with curated visions of pain. In medieval Europe, public punishment was inseparable from civic life. Market squares doubled as execution sites. Gallows loomed at town gates. Pillories stood in central streets. Torture in courts might have been hidden, but the outcome, the mutilated body, the shamed criminal, was displayed openly. The condemned thief might have ears cropped, the adulteress paraded in shame, the heretic burned. The theatre was deliberate. Neighbours gathered to watch, to jeer, to gossip. Parents brought children so they would learn the lesson. Pain was not only about the individual, it was about reinforcing a shared hierarchy. Executions themselves were staged with detail. In France and the German lands, breaking on the wheel turned bones into pulp while crowds gasped. In England, traitors were drawn and quartered, their remains displayed on city walls. In Spain, the auto da fe dressed heresy in liturgy, combining sermon, confession, and burning in one event. The condemned wore symbolic garments, the crowd chanted, the fire roared. Pain was spectacle and catechism at once. By the 18th century, critics began to recoil. Philosophers like Beccaria and reformers in parliaments argued that public cruelty brutalized the crowd instead of civilizing it. Michel Foucault, writing centuries later, would describe how power shifted, from bodies on scaffolds to souls in prisons. Yet in the meantime, public executions remained. Guillotines in revolutionary France turned beheadings into daily ritual, crowds munching bread as nobles fell. In England, Tyburn drew thousands who treated hangings as carnival. The 19th century kept gallows busy even as newspapers began to criticize. The spectacle lingered because it served too many purposes: deterrence, distraction, catharsis. Outside Europe, spectacle was just as central. In Ottoman towns, floggings and bastinado were carried out in public squares, watched by merchants and children alike. In China, beheadings were staged in markets, severed heads displayed on stakes. In Japan, crucifixions and burnings of criminals were done before villages. Pain was woven into community identity. Everyone knew what law could do because everyone had seen it done. Colonial empires transplanted this theatre overseas. British administrators in India staged executions of rebels before crowds, tying men to cannons and firing so their bodies exploded. French authorities in Algeria flogged villagers publicly. In the Congo, cutting off hands was not always secret. It was done where neighbours could see, ensuring the terror spread. Spectacle was efficient. One body punished, hundreds frightened. The 20th century complicates the picture. States begin to claim that they are civilized, humane, modern. Public torture becomes embarrassing, but public execution remains. In the United States, lynchings in the South turn into grotesque festivals. postcards printed with burned bodies, crowds cheering as men are hanged from trees. In Soviet Russia, show trials broadcast confessions, extracted by torture-turned-courtroom into theatre. The execution itself may be private, but the humiliation is public. In Nazi Germany, deportations and executions are staged with parades of prisoners, watched by neighbours who pretend not to see and yet cannot forget. The guillotine in France survives into the 1970s, though the spectacle shrinks. Hangings in Britain are moved inside prisons in the mid-19th century, but rumours and newspaper accounts keep the public fascinated. Spectacle shifts from square to print. Instead of gathering in markets, citizens read about punishments in newspapers, look at sketches, later photographs. The crowd is still present, only dispersed. Fascist regimes in the 20th century exploit spectacle deliberately. Mussolini stages parades of prisoners. Hitler orchestrates rallies that merge ideology with threat. Torture is hidden in camps, but the intimidation is public. Neighbors see Jews march through streets, prisoners paraded in chains. Stalin's show trials make humiliation broadcast entertainment, with radio and newspapers amplifying it. Pain itself may be hidden, but the performance of obedience is staged. In the age of television, spectacle of pain takes new forms. The Vietnam War broadcasts images of prisoners, napalm-burned children, men shot on streets. These images horrify audiences abroad, galvanizing protest. States learn that spectacle can backfire. What terrifies at home may scandalize overseas. Yet the temptation persists. In Latin American dictatorships, prisoners are paraded on television, confessing crimes after torture. In the United States, photographs from Abu Ghraib in 2004 show naked, hooded prisoners stacked in pyramids, dogs snarling at their faces. Soldiers laugh, cameras click. The spectacle circulates worldwide. What was supposed to intimidate detainees humiliates the nation instead. Terrorist groups exploit the same logic. In the early 21st century, organizations like ISIS release videos of beheadings, burnings, executions. These are choreographed productions meant to horrify enemies, inspire followers, prove ruthlessness. Pain becomes propaganda, broadcast to millions. The medieval scaffold has been replaced by the digital screen, but the logic is unchanged. One person's torment is meant to discipline the many. Spectacle also infiltrates entertainment. Films show torture as drama, heroes enduring pain, villains inflicting it. Audiences watch with fascination, sometimes horror, sometimes excitement. Video games turn interrogation into mechanics. Reality television and extreme shows flirt with humiliation as spectacle. The boundary between real torment and staged suffering blurs in cultural memory. The same species that once gathered at Tyburn now gathers around screens, watching pain repackaged as plot. He realizes that the spectacle of torture never vanishes. It only migrates. From markets to newspapers, from gallows to cameras, from scaffolds to viral videos, societies continue to stage pain as lesson. Sometimes the lesson is obedience, sometimes it is entertainment, sometimes it is outrage. But the pattern is constant. The suffering of one body educates the imagination of many. The persistence of spectacle explains why torture endures despite reforms. Hidden dungeons produce fear for victims, but spectacle produces fear for communities. A severed hand displayed in Congo terrifies workers more than secret beatings. A witch burned in a square silences neighbors more than a hidden rack. A leaked photograph of a hooded prisoner humiliated by guards damages reputations worldwide more than any denial. Visibility is part of power. And so he leaves the square with a sobering thought. The crowd may no longer gather around wheels and scaffolds, but they gather around screens and newspapers. Pain is still consumed communally, whether as deterrent, propaganda, or entertainment. Torture may hide in white rooms, but its echoes are always public. Society still teaches itself through spectacle, proving that cruelty is not only private domination, but public ritual. The theatre has changed costumes, but the play remains the same. One person's torment staged so that many others might obey, fear, or gasp. The scaffold has become the broadcast. The screams have become headlines, images, clips. Humanity has not stopped watching. It has only changed seats. He walks into the great hall of justifications, a place louder than any dungeon. The air hums with sermons, manifestos, speeches, legal treatises. Torture does not survive only because rulers order it or soldiers wield it. It survives because belief systems frame it as necessary, even sacred. From medieval cathedrals to revolutionary assemblies, from mosques and temples to Cold War propaganda offices, every ideology has found ways to bend cruelty into duty. Pain is rarely called what it is. It is called purification, defense, progress, salvation. Religion is the oldest voice in this hall. In medieval Christendom, inquisitors framed the rack and strappado as medicinal. The heretic's soul was diseased. Pain was a surgery to save it. The heretic who confessed under torment might reconcile with the church and die absolved, his eternal fate salvaged even if his temporal body broke. Bernard Gouy and other inquisitorial writers filled manuals with cautions against excess, but their core assumption was never questioned. Better a broken body than a lost soul. To spectators, the screams outside the cathedral walls were proof that faith defended itself. To the victims, they were proof that faith devoured. The crusading age wrapped cruelty in holy banners. Captives were tortured not only for information, but to humiliate enemies of the faith. Saracens and pagans were beaten, burned, mutilated in ways chroniclers sometimes described with disgust, sometimes with pride. Christian knights believed they served God's justice. Their enemies believed they revealed hypocrisy. Both sides occasionally mirrored each other, proving that ideology's colour may differ, but its logic of cruelty rhymes. Islamic jurisprudence, too, contains its debates. The Quran and Hadith forbid mutilation and emphasize justice, yet rulers across centuries sanctioned floggings, amputations, and interrogations in the name of order. The Mamluks and Ottomans turned bastinado into a routine practice, defended as discipline. During periods of jihad, rebels and heretics could be tortured with the same rhetoric Christians used. Safeguarding the community of believers justified pain. Scholars sometimes objected, but rulers usually prevailed. Ideology sanctified what law alone could not. In Asia, Confucian and Buddhist traditions often stressed harmony and compassion, yet dynasties from China to Vietnam kept torture embedded in legal codes. Confession was treated as a restoration of cosmic order. Torture, though regrettable, was tolerated as the tool to reach it. Magistrates justified bamboo beatings and finger presses by claiming society's balance depended on truth spoken aloud. Even Buddhism, in some militant moments, cloaked violence in rhetoric of karmic correction. Ideology acted as balm over the lash. Move forward, and ideology grows secular, but no less fervent. The Enlightenment's revolution spoke of rights and liberty, yet the guillotine sang daily in Paris squares. Jacobins claimed terror was virtue, pain was pedagogy, executions were lessons in equality. Dissenters were broken in prisons, their bodies a sacrifice to the Republic. Religion was denounced, but the logic remained. Cruelty was necessary for salvation. Only now salvation meant the nation. The 19th century's empires cloaked cruelty in the civilizing mission. Colonizers declared that floggings, forced labor, mutilations were not torture, but discipline for savages who needed instruction. Missionaries sometimes protested, but many also absorbed the logic, pain as pedagogy for heathens. In the Congo, cutting off hands was justified in reports as necessary to maintain order among workers. In India, flogging peasants was described as administrative correction. Empire was built on pain disguised as progress, and ideology provided the mask. The 20th century radicalized the link between ideology and cruelty. Fascism elevated pain to spectacle. Mussolini's Italy used beatings, humiliations, forced castor oil feedings as rituals of control, celebrated in propaganda as proof of virility. Nazi Germany turned torture into racial science. Experiments on camp prisoners were justified as medical research for the folk. Victims were called subhuman. Pain was declared irrelevant to their dignity. Ideology made cruelty not only permissible, but righteous. Communism produced its own sermons of necessity. In Stalin's USSR, the NKVD tortured millions not to extract truth, but to produce confessions that legitimized purges. Ideology insisted the party could not err. Therefore, if a man was accused, he must be guilty, and confession must follow. Torture was the bridge between accusation and proof. Guards and interrogators told themselves they defended socialism, protected the revolution, purified society. Victims were labeled traitors, saboteurs, wreckers. Ideology gave their screams a script. During anti-colonial wars of the mid-20th century, both sides invoked ideology. French officers in Algeria justified electrocution and water torture by claiming they defended civilization from terrorism. FLN guerrillas tortured suspected collaborators with knives and fire, insisting they defended liberation. In Vietnam, Americans spoke of democracy while shocking prisoners. Viet Cong cadres spoke of revolution while punishing captives. Each believed their cruelty was justified because their cause was pure. Ideology turned dungeons into temples of necessity. The Cold War intensified the pattern. The United States, facing communist expansion, trained allies in interrogation techniques that included sensory deprivation, stress positions, humiliation. Manuals framed them as non-torture, emphasizing their scientific basis. The Soviet bloc continued psychological and physical torment, defending it as protection against imperialism. Both camps signed international conventions banning torture. Both found loopholes through ideology. Security was survival, survival was morality. Morality justified pain. Religion did not disappear from this hall of justifications. In Latin America, juntas allied with conservative Catholicism claimed to defend Christian civilization against atheistic Marxism, and priests sometimes blessed interrogators. In the Islamic world, regimes and insurgents alike invoked God to justify cruelty. Some claimed that punishing traitors was a form of divine justice. Others insisted martyrdom sanctified their own victims. The rhetoric of holy duty never vanished. It adapted. Even humanitarian rhetoric became a mask. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, officials insisted waterboarding and stress positions were not torture, but enhanced interrogation. Legal memos split hairs over definitions, claiming that unless organs failed or death occurred, pain was lawful. The ideology here was not religion or revolution, but security. Saving lives justified torment. The same syllogism inquisitors had whispered centuries earlier, better a body broken than a soul lost, returned in modern costume. Better a prisoner broken than a city bombed. What unites these centuries of justifications is their sameness. Whether the language is salvation, harmony, progress, revolution, or security, ideology always rebrands cruelty as necessity. Torturers rarely see themselves as sadists. They see themselves as servants of something larger. They defend faith, defend nations, defend order, defend civilization. The victims become symbols. Heretics, savages, subhumans, traitors, terrorists. Once labeled, their pain ceases to matter and cruelty becomes service. But ideology does more than excuse. It motivates. Inquisitors tortured with fervor because they believed they saved souls. Nazis experimented because they believed in racial destiny. Revolutionaries punished because they believed betrayal doomed the cause. American interrogators waterboarded because they believed they prevented attacks. Ideology makes cruelty not reluctant, but enthusiastic. It converts doubt into duty. He leaves the Hall of Justifications unsettled because he sees that torture has never lacked arguments. It is always defended as exceptional, always draped in noble language, always denied as cruelty. What changes are the banners overhead: cross, crescent, hammer and sickle, eagle, tricolour, flag of terror. What does not change are the screams below. And he understands this too. As long as humans can frame pain as serving a higher good, they will find ways to inflict it. Torture has always been less about sadism than about ideology's hunger for proof, purity, and obedience. It has always lived in the gap between what rulers demand and what victims can endure. And the gap is always filled with words that make screams sound like necessity. He enters the present century, and at first he thinks the dungeon is gone. There are no racks in museums of justice, no pillories in squares, no inquisitors sharpening quills in cloisters. Yet when he looks closer, he finds the same structure, only hidden behind new walls and disguised in new language. Torture now exists under the cover of democracy, in states that sign conventions, publish constitutions, and proclaim rights. The difference is not disappearance, but mutation. Cruelty becomes bureaucratic, technological, and psychological, hidden behind euphemisms like interrogation, detention, or security measure. The architecture of secrecy is the first clue. Black sites, secret prisons operated by intelligence services, dot the globe. The United States builds them after 2001, scattering them in Poland, Romania, Thailand, Afghanistan. Officially, the state bans torture. Unofficially, detainees are flown hooded and shackled on rendition flights to places where oversight is impossible. The European Convention on Human Rights is still celebrated in Strasbourg, while prisoners are strapped to boards in anonymous rooms. The architecture is deliberate. Plausible deniability is built into walls, flight logs, contracts. The dungeon survives, only outsourced and encrypted. Technology joins the work. Surveillance states discover that pain need not begin in cells. It begins on screens. Governments collect metadata, track movements, harvest conversations. A suspect arrives in interrogation already naked in another sense. Their digital life stripped bare, their secrets exposed. Interrogators can weaponize this knowledge, showing transcripts of private calls, photographs of families, threats crafted from precise detail. The effect mirrors medieval torment, helplessness, exposure, fear. Where once a rack spread the body open, now databases strip the mind. Psychological pressure is refined. Isolation is perfected in supermax prisons. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in concrete boxes, fluorescent lights humming, meals slid through slots. Guards rarely speak. Silence becomes the whip. Studies show solitary confinement causes hallucinations, depression, self-harm. Yet officials insist it is not torture, merely discipline. The UN condemns it as cruel, inhuman, degrading. The line between discipline and torment is the same thin line medieval jurists drew, only shifted forward centuries. Democracies experiment with no-touch techniques. Stress positions, kneeling, standing with arms extended, crouching in boxes, are enforced for hours. Prisoners are deprived of sleep, blasted with sound, plunged into cold. Lawyers draft memos defining torture narrowly. Only pain equivalent to organ failure counts. Everything else is enhanced interrogation. The vocabulary itself becomes an instrument, a way to inflict without confessing. Medieval inquisitors prayed over their implements. Modern officials issue press releases. Both are rituals of justification. Digital technology creates new frontiers. Interrogators use bright screens, strobe lights, constant video surveillance. Some prisoners are forced to wear virtual reality headsets playing disorienting images, a 21st century update of sensory assault. Others are subjected to deep listening, headphones blasting repetitive sounds for days. The line between interrogation and experiment blurs again, just as it did when doctors in camps measured hypothermia. Now the laboratory is digital, but the effect is the same: destabilize the mind until it yields. Economic systems can themselves function as torture. Migrants detained in sprawling camps face indefinite confinement, lack of medical care, exposure to heat or cold, rationed food. Guards need not beat. Conditions themselves do the work. In refugee detention centres from Libya to Australia, testimonies describe beatings, but also despair engineered by uncertainty. No charges, no timelines, no future. The cruelty is bureaucratic, but the screams are real. Drones and modern warfare add another dimension. A suspect knows that even beyond prison walls, surveillance drones buzz overhead, recording daily life. Families of alleged militants are bombed, neighbours are punished. The community itself becomes hostage, its suffering leveraged to pressure fighters. This is torture at scale, not one body on the rack, but entire villages under fear. The pain is communal, broadcast by buzzing machines controlled remotely. The interrogator now holds a joystick, not a whip, but the principle is unchanged. Propaganda remains tied to spectacle. Photographs from Abu Ghraib in 2004 revealed hooded men with wires, naked prisoners stacked in pyramids, soldiers grinning at humiliation. These were not accidents but rituals, staged for cameras, shared as trophies. They echo medieval executions in public squares. Only now the crowd is global, consuming images through media. The shame of exposure compounds the pain. Prisoners are not only broken physically, but displayed as conquered symbols. Ideology continues to frame cruelty. Leaders insist pain prevents terrorism, protects democracy, preserves order. Security replaces salvation as justification. In China, camps for Uyghurs are defended as re-education, yet survivors describe beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological torment. In Russia, prisons blend old-fashioned beatings with systematic humiliation, defended as discipline. In the United States, Guantanamo persists decades after its creation, a legal black hole defended as necessary. Everywhere, the refrain is the same. Necessity trumps law, exceptions prove rules, torture by another name is not torture. What is new is exposure. NGOS, journalists, whistleblowers publish reports, photographs, testimonies. Human rights law declares torture absolutely forbidden, no exceptions. Yet states continue, embarrassed but persistent. The paradox defines the modern era. Never before have so many governments outlawed torture, and never before have so many practiced it covertly. The tension between law and practice is constant, a battle fought in courts, headlines, and secret rooms. Even culture absorbs this duality. Films dramatize torture as heroic test, the suspect who endures, the spy who resists, the villain who inflicts. Television shows like 24 glamorize ticking time bomb scenarios, persuading audiences that cruelty saves lives. Popular culture normalizes what law condemns. Just as medieval crowds gathered to watch executions, modern audiences gather around screens to consume torture as entertainment. The spectacle persists, only stylized. And then there is technology's next horizon. Artificial intelligence analyzes prisoners' speech, micro-expressions, pulse rates, predicting when they will break. Virtual simulations train interrogators. Neural stimulators could, in theory, induce pain without touch, bypassing skin entirely. The future threatens to mechanize torment further, making it invisible, deniable, efficient. Pain becomes digital, the body a circuit, the scream a data point. Yet the survivors' voices persist. Men released from Guantanamo describe white rooms, waterboarding, mock executions. Women freed from Syrian prisons recount rape, humiliation, electrocution. Refugees from Chinese camps speak of endless propaganda sessions, sleep deprivation, beatings. Russian dissidents describe poisonings, stress, and intimidation. Their testimonies echo across courts and commissions, proving that despite denials, the old reality continues. The pattern is unmistakable. Torture has always adapted to the language of the age. Inquisitors spoke of souls, Jacobins of virtue, Nazis of science, Soviets of socialism, Americans of security. Each era wraps screams in noble words. The implements change, the excuses mutate, but the principle remains. Torture is the shadow side of power, constant, shape-shifting, justified, denied. So he leaves the present with a bitter realization. Humanity has outlawed torture more often than it has practiced anything else, yet the bans are ceremonial, the practices eternal. Pain survives every convention, every declaration, every oath. In courts, in black sites, in camps, in prisons, in digital networks, it remains. The dungeon is no longer stone and iron, it is fluorescent light, surveillance camera, endless paperwork. But the purpose is ancient. Break bodies to control minds, break minds to control societies. The irony is final. The age that invented universal human rights also invented the technologies to torture invisibly, deniably, efficiently. Progress and cruelty walk together just as they always have. The scream is still present, even if it now reverberates through servers instead of scaffolds. Humanity has not abandoned torture, it has only given it Wi-Fi. He moves out of the cells and into the museums because torture has always left artifacts behind, and societies that condemn the practice often preserve its tools with a curious mixture of shame and fascination. Iron collars, racks, boots, thumbscrews, objects once smeared with blood, are now displayed under glass, polished by curators, explained on placards. Crowds wander through halls in Nuremberg, Toledo, London, Mexico City. They peer at instruments with nervous laughter or quiet awe, imagining the screams that once filled chambers. Torture becomes history, consumed like any other exhibit. The memory of cruelty is curated. In Europe, countless castles advertise dungeons where tourists descend into cool stone corridors. Wax figures writhe in cages, mannequins stretch on racks. Many of these displays are exaggerations, borrowing freely from fantasy. Yet they speak to a persistent fascination. The medieval world is remembered less for its markets or music than for its cruelty. The tools of torment become icons of dark ages. Guides recite stories of witches burned, heretics broken, thieves flogged. Visitors gasp, shudder, and move on to the gift shop. Torture here is entertainment disguised as education. Yet some museums treat memory with gravity. In Berlin's Topography of Terror, photographs of Gestapo cells and documents of interrogations remind visitors how modern states used old logic. In Santiago, Chile, Villa Grimaldi stands as memorial to victims of Pinochet's secret police, with cells preserved, testimonies etched into walls. In Johannesburg, Constitution Hill exhibits solitary cells of apartheid, where prisoners endured beatings and humiliation. These spaces are not carnivals, but shrines. They frame torture not as curiosity, but as warning. The contrast between tourist dungeons and memorial prisons reveals society's split, memory commodified, memory sanctified. Films amplify both tendencies. Hollywood has long used torture as plot. In medieval epics, heroes resist racks. In thrillers, villains reveal secrets under duress. In spy stories, agents endure waterboarding before escaping. Torture scenes are staged for tension, horror, catharsis. Viewers consume pain as spectacle, just as crowds once consumed executions. The ticking time bomb scenario, where torment is justified to save lives, reappears endlessly from 24 to 0 Dark 30. These narratives normalize cruelty, persuading audiences that pain can be rational, even heroic. Few films dwell on the long aftermath, the trauma, the silence, the shame. Torture is edited into a 3-act scene, not a lifetime scar. But cinema also critiques. Films like The Battle of Algiers expose French paratroopers torturing rebels, showing how cruelty erodes legitimacy. Documentaries about Latin American dictatorships replay testimonies, faces lined with memory. Arthouse films stage minimalist scenes of deprivation, white rooms, silence, flickering lights, to evoke psychological torment. Directors wrestle with the ethical question, how to represent cruelty without reproducing its spectacle. Some succeed, others fail, but the attempt itself proves memory's persistence. Literature carries the screams too. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago describes interrogations, sleepless nights, cells. Primo Levi recounts experiments and humiliation in Auschwitz. Latin American survivors publish memoirs of picanha and disappearances. Middle Eastern exiles write of bastinado and rape in secret prisons. Each book turns private agony into public testimony, refusing silence. These works shape how generations imagine torture, not as abstract debate, but as lived torment. Societies debate whether to preserve instruments physically. Some towns destroy gallows and racks after abolition, cleansing civic memory. Others keep them as relics. The Tower of London still shows manacles. The rack, cells carved with prisoners' graffiti. In Nuremberg, Iron Maidens, largely apocryphal inventions, are displayed anyway, symbols more than realities. Critics argue such exhibits sensationalize, trivialize suffering. Supporters say they educate, reminding visitors of cruelty's reality. The argument itself shows discomfort. Memory of torture is never neutral. Religions wrestle with memory too. Churches that once sanctioned inquisitions now apologize, issue statements, build memorials. The Vatican acknowledges abuses, though carefully. Protestant groups recall witch burnings with embarrassment. Muslim clerics debate historical floggings and amputations, some defending tradition, others condemning past harshness. Jewish memory preserves persecution in medieval Europe, where torture accompanied expulsions and pogroms. Each faith negotiates its own past, trying to reconcile divine mercy with human cruelty justified in God's name. Modern politics uses memory as weapon. Governments point to medieval racks or Nazi camps to condemn enemies. American officials cite Saddam Hussein's torture chambers to justify war, ignoring Guantanamo. Russian leaders decry CIA black sites while running their own prisons. Memory is mobilized selectively, cruelty remembered only when useful. Victims' testimonies are invoked, then ignored. Torture becomes rhetorical cudgel rather than moral lesson. Education faces the same dilemma. Should children learn about torture? Some curricula sanitize history, speaking vaguely of harsh punishments. Others confront directly, teaching about inquisitions, slavery, gulags. Teachers worry. Too much detail horrifies, too little trivializes. Museums offer school tours, carefully edited. Memory is filtered, always mediated, never raw. Yet survivors refuse filters. Testimonies in Truth commissions in Argentina, South Africa, Rwanda confront societies with blunt detail. Families of the disappeared march with photographs. Former prisoners describe electrodes, dogs, drownings. Their voices disrupt sanitized memory, forcing states to reckon. Sometimes apologies follow, sometimes silence. But the act of testimony itself is defiance, memory as weapon against denial. Technology reshapes memory. The internet spreads leaked photographs instantly. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, Syrian prisons. Once, torture was whispered. Now it circulates in viral images. Some audiences respond with outrage, others with fatigue. Endless repetition risks numbing. Pain becomes another news item, scrolled past. The challenge of memory is not only preserving, but preventing indifference. He notices how even artifacts inspire ambivalence. A rack behind glass draws laughter from tourists. A pair of shackles in a memorial draws tears. The difference is context. Memory framed as entertainment trivializes. Memory framed as testimony dignifies. Societies choose which path to take. Often they choose both at once. Carnival dungeon tours in one town, solemn Holocaust museums in another. Humanity cannot decide whether to treat torture as history lesson or horror attraction. Artists wrestle with this tension. Installations recreate cells with lights and sound, inviting visitors to feel disorientation. Sculptors carve bodies twisted in agony, frozen mid-scream. Pain is translated into form, meant to provoke empathy. Some critics call it exploitation, others call it necessary confrontation. The fact that art grapples with torture at all proves its haunting power. Even language preserves memory. Phrases like, under the question, rack your brains, bootstrapped, trace back to instruments of torment. We speak casually, forgetting origins, yet every metaphor carries residue of screams. Memory lingers in idioms, unnoticed but alive. And the debate continues. Should societies keep these memories vivid or let them fade? Some argue that dwelling on cruelty poisons identity, teaching despair. Others argue that forgetting invites repetition. Both are partly right. Memory is painful, but absence of memory is dangerous. Museums, films, testimonies, these are imperfect, but they keep the past present. Torture thrives in silence. Memory interrupts it. He leaves this gallery of remembrance with one realization. Torture never ends in the moment of pain. It endures in the memories of victims, in the debates of societies, in the artifacts under glass, in the images on screens. Memory itself becomes battlefield, between trivialization and testimony, denial and acknowledgement, spectacle and warning. The tools rust, the dungeons collapse, the regimes fall, but the echoes persist. And as long as people argue over whether to display a rack, as long as survivors tell their stories, as long as words like enhanced interrogation circulate, memory ensures torture remains visible. That visibility is fragile, but it is the only shield we have. He begins to close the circle, tracing the long arc from the medieval dungeon to the fluorescent interrogation cell, and what he sees is not a story of progress, but of mutation. Torture has changed costumes more often than actors change masks, yet the script remains. Pain as language of power, suffering as punctuation of fear, obedience extracted from screams. To write an ending, he must look back across centuries and notice not only the cruelty, but the reasons it persists. In the medieval world, torture was law's crutch. Judges who had lost the ordeal as proof needed confessions, and pain supplied them. The rack, the strappato, the boot, all devised not for sadism, but for certainty, or at least the appearance of it. Pain became the bridge between suspicion and sentence. Heretics, thieves, rebels, all learned that silence was impossible once iron turned. The justification was religious, procedural, juridical. Better to break one body than to let society doubt its order. In the early modern centuries, the target shifted to witches and rebels, and torture metastasized with hysteria. Old women, healers, neighbors were dragged to cells, pressed with questions about Sabbaths, devils, conspiracies. Pain multiplied accusations. Accusations multiplied pain. The wheels spun until thousands burned, confessed under torment to crimes they never conceived. Courts told themselves they were protecting faith. Pamphlets told readers they were cleansing evil. In reality, Torture became panic made flesh. Enlightenment reformers declared this barbarism. Beccaria, Montesquieu, Voltaire, they condemned pain as irrational, as false proof, as stain on reason. Codes were rewritten, torture abolished in statutes. And yet slavery, colonial conquest, and prisons absorbed it seamlessly. The lash on plantations, the mutilations in Congo, the treadmills in English jails were torture by another name, exported and industrialized. Europe congratulated itself on progress while hands were cut off for rubber quotas. The contradiction was glaring but ignored. The 20th century stripped away pretenses. Stalin's USSR tortured millions into confessions no one believed. Nazi camps turned pain into experiment, measuring how long a man could live in ice water, how lungs collapsed under pressure. Japanese forces perfected water torture. Democracies joined too. In Algeria, Kenya, Vietnam, prisoners were shocked, beaten, drowned. In the Americas, juntas disappeared tens of thousands, their bodies electrified, their names erased. In the United States, intelligence agencies studied sensory deprivation, drugs, white rooms, waterboarding. Every ideology claimed necessity. Every ideology rediscovered the same screams. The 21st century only refined denial. Enhanced interrogation became a phrase to split hairs between law and reality. White rooms, sleep deprivation, stress positions were said to be harsh but legal. Waterboarding, drowning in fragments, was declared not torture because organs did not fail. The hypocrisy reached theatre. Governments signed conventions banning pain absolutely, then wrote memos permitting it. Torture became both outlawed and institutionalized, condemned and practiced. The dungeon was hidden behind euphemism. So why does it persist? The answer is not only cruelty, but structure. Torture survives because power fears silence. Judges once needed confessions, dictators needed obedience, empires needed labor, counterinsurgencies needed intelligence. Pain is immediate, visible, persuasive. It seems efficient even when it produces lies. It promises control when control feels impossible. That promise is enough to seduce rulers again and again. It also survives because ideology blesses it. Inquisitors called it salvation, Jacobins called it virtue, Nazis called it science, Stalinists called it socialism, Democrats called it security. Every age wraps torment in noble words. Few torturers think themselves sadists, most think themselves servants. They defend faith, protect nations, preserve order. Victims are renamed. Heretics, witches, subhumans, traitors, terrorists. Once renamed, their pain ceases to matter. Spectacle ensures memory, and memory ensures repetition. Crowds once gathered to watch burnings, later to read confessions in newspapers, now to view leaked photographs online. Torture is not only a hidden practice, it is a performance. The hooded man on a box at Abu Ghraib is the descendant of the thief in a pillory at Tyburn. Both exist as warnings, both consumed by spectators. Pain teaches communities who holds power. That pedagogical function makes it attractive even to regimes that deny it. And yet, resistance never vanishes. Survivors testify in courts and truth commissions. Writers like Solzhenitsyn, Levi, survivors of Latin America and the Middle East, transform scars into words. NGOS document, lawyers litigate, journalists publish. The persistence of testimony proves torture's failure. Pain silences some, but others speak louder. Torture may break bodies, but it often leaves memories sharp enough to cut regimes later. Argentina's generals, Pinochet in Chile, colonial officers in France, all eventually faced exposure. Torture that seemed efficient became liability once memories surfaced. Still, he cannot deny the allure. In times of fear, terrorism, war, rebellion, states return to pain instinctively. The ticking time bomb fantasy thrives in culture because it promises necessity. Popular films, television, games normalize torment as plot device. Citizens tolerate what they might otherwise condemn, persuaded that cruelty saves lives. This cultural rehearsal keeps torture ready for the next crisis. The future offers new methods. Artificial intelligence already analyzes stress in voices, eyes, heartbeats. Neural stimulators can induce pain without touch. Virtual reality can disorient more effectively than white rooms. States may one day argue that because no scars remain, no torture occurs. The same euphemism game will continue, only updated with digital gloss. The screen will survive, even if it becomes data. And so he closes the circle with the bitter truth. Torture has never been abolished, only renamed. It has shifted from ordeal to rack, from rack to colony, from colony to camp, from camp to white room, from white room to algorithm. It is outlawed in every major convention, yet practiced on every continent. It is condemned in speeches, yet budgeted in secret. It is memory, weapon, denial, and theatre at once. He asks why humanity cannot let it go. The answer is bleak, because torture speaks a language everyone understands. It requires no translation, no law degree, no theology. It is efficient at producing compliance, even when it produces no truth. It flatters rulers with the illusion of control. It frightens communities into obedience. It entertains audiences morbidly. And ideology forever finds words to sanctify it. That is the story stretching from medieval Europe to the digital age, a continuity of screams disguised in new costumes. What began with a judge desperate for confession now ends with intelligence officers staring at screens. The bodies differ, the rooms differ, the rhetoric differs, but the essence remains. Torture is power's oldest lie, promising certainty in uncertainty, obedience in chaos. And until societies learn to live with uncertainty without reaching for screams, the instruments, whether iron, bamboo, or algorithm, will never fully vanish. He leaves the hall, the dungeon, the museum, and the courtroom with one last echo, not of a whip or a boot, but of silence, the kind that follows every scream. That silence is the only true ending torture offers. Silence of victims too broken to speak, silence of societies that look away, silence of governments that deny. But in memory, in testimony, in art, the scream endures, refusing to fade. That endurance is both the curse and the hope. Curse because it reminds us cruelty never dies. Hope because it ensures cruelty is never entirely hidden.